Late in the afternoon of August 7th, 1972, in Springfield Township, New Jersey, 16-year-old Jeanette DePalma decided to pay a visit to a friend of hers. The end of the summer break was fast approaching, and Jeanette wanted to make the most of it before she had to return to school. So, after asking permission from her mother, she left her home on Clearview Road and headed towards a nearby train station. Over at her friend's place, her friend became concerned when Jeanette didn't arrive, but having assumed that Jeanette had simply changed her mind about the visit, she didn't freak out or raise the alarm. However, later that night, when Jeanette failed to return home from her outing, her parents grew increasingly worried for their daughter's safety. The following day, the DePalma family filed a missing persons report with the local Springfield Police Department, and as the days went by, the search for the missing teenager grew ever more intense. Then, on September 19th, just short of 6 weeks after Jeanette first went missing, a man was walking his dog atop a cliff inside of Springfield's Haldale Quarry. At one point, the dog ran off, just as unleashed dogs are likely to do, and according to its owner, it seemed particularly interested in something concealed among a patch of dense foliage. As it began to run back to him, the owner noticed his dog was carrying something in its mouth. He assumed it was a log of some kind, some pale, barkless tree limb that had been bleached by the sun over time. Yet as his dog came closer, the man realized what was clamped between the dog's jaws wasn't made of wood at all. It was a hunk of decomposing flesh in the form of a severed human forearm. He quickly contacted the police, who descended on the quarry in the hopes that they could rule out the possibility of the forearm having once belonged to Jeanette DePalma. After all, this was Jersey in the 70s. It wouldn't be the first dead body to be dumped in a quarry, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But after scouring the quarry and finding the body that the forearm had belonged to, law enforcement was faced with the grim prospect of contacting the DePalma family to inform them that their daughter had been murdered. Yet as if Jeanette's abduction and murder wasn't frightening enough, the police then had to deal with a considerably more horrifying aspect of the case, and it involved the condition in which her body had been found. According to eyewitnesses, Jeanette's corpse had been disposed of in a deeply unsettling fashion. Whoever had killed her hadn't just dumped her body off of a cliffside known to locals as the Devil's Teeth, but they had arranged a series of sticks and twigs around her body that formed the distinct shape of a coffin. Not only that, but her killer had carved several small wooden crosses out of twigs and sticks before placing them upside down around her lifeless head. Some claim the shape of a pentagram had been carved out of the dirt underneath her, and that the remains of several mutilated animals had been placed on top of her body. And while law enforcement denied that being the case, they were forced to admit that certain parts of these eyewitness accounts were true. The mysteries of the case deepened when the Union County Coroner's Office reported that they could not identify the distinct cause of Jeanette's death. Neither her dead body nor the clothing she wore at the time of her death showed any signs of bone fractures, bullet holes, or stab wounds. What's more, no drug paraphernalia was found on or around the body, and her remains tested negative for any kinds of narcotics. In the end, when pressed for an estimate on her cause of death, the coroner was forced to deduce that Jeanette had died from some kind of soft asphyxiation, meaning that someone had softly placed a cloth or pillow over her face, slowly preventing her from getting enough oxygen. This was the only way someone would be able to kill her without leaving any signs of their handiwork on the body. But it also raised the question of how someone was able to do something like that without any resistance. If they'd rendered her unconscious through drugs or violence, it would be relatively easy to detect, and if they'd forced the fabric over her mouth and nose while she was still awake, there was a good chance she'd have been able to scratch at her killer, which would leave skin samples under her nails. The coroner reported that this wasn't the case, that Jeanette's nails were clean, and that she couldn't have been restrained in any other way because there was no bruising around her wrists or elbows. The only thing the coroner had noticed was that there seemed to be an unusually high amount of lead in Jeanette's digestive system at the time of her death, but they were also quick to note that she didn't die of lead poisoning, and that the substance could have come from drinking water or food, accumulating over time until there was enough to become detectable. Officially, Jeanette had died of asphyxiation, but unofficially, her death remained a complete and utter mystery. But it was a mystery that local law enforcement was determined to get to the bottom of. Early on in their investigation, 2 homicide detectives received a tip regarding a local homeless man named Red, who lived alone in a wooded area not far from the quarry. The anonymous tipster alleged that Red had fled his woodland campsite not long after Jeanette had been declared missing, and if even he wasn't the man responsible for her murder, he had certainly acted as if though he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have. The Union County Prosecutor's Office issued a warrant for Red's arrest, and after an intense period of questioning, it was determined he'd had nothing to do with Jeanette's death. However, both of the homicide detectives who'd questioned him believed he was withholding information in some way. But even after threatening him with jail time on account of perverting the course of justice, Red still didn't want to give them the full explanation of why he'd fled his woodland campsite. One of these detectives later said that when asked if he'd seen anyone acting suspicious around the area known as the Devil's Teeth, Red had gone completely silent, in a way that suggested that he was fearful of talking about what he'd seen that night. When asked if he'd been intimidated or threatened by those responsible for Jeanette's murder, Red began visibly sweating, yet continued to keep his mouth shut no matter how much the detectives tried to entice him to talk. It was the opinion of this particular homicide detective that Red had been alerted to the goings-on inside the quarry that night, and being a rather curious soul, he'd gone to investigate the eerie noises he'd heard. Whoever was disposing Jeanette's body had then spotted him, pursued him, then intimidated him into silence by threatening him with bodily harm should he ever speak of the things he'd witnessed that night. However, without any other corroborating evidence to prove it, this line of investigation would be completely fruitless, and there was no way to force Red to admit this to them without violating his inalienable constitutional rights. With the Red angle essentially exhausted, the detectives assigned to Jeanette's case continued to fish leads among the DePalma family as well as the wider public. But due to a lack of solid information, along with inconsistent stories told to the police by her family, friends, and peers, the case eventually went cold. Just over 2 weeks after Jeanette's body was discovered, the Newark Star-Ledger and the New York Daily News caught wind of the disturbing conditions in which her body had been disposed of, and started running stories claiming that Jeanette had been murdered as part of some sacrificial occult ritual. James Tate, the pastor of the DePalma family's Assembly of God's Church, seemed to confirm his own personal beliefs in these rumors when he spoke of a local coven of witches who operated inside nearby Watchung Nature Reserve. He said that he had long been aware of the group's existence and said it was only a matter of time before they acted on their ungodly creed to take the lives of his congregation. Having a man of God talk so candidly about such a thing sowed panic among the citizens of Union County, who were still in a state of emotional trauma as a result of the List family murders of the year before. 2 women and 3 children had been shot in cold blood at their home in nearby Westfield before the family patriarch suddenly went missing. The murders weren't solved until the late 1980s when it was discovered that John List himself was responsible for killing his whole family. But while the cause remained a mystery, numerous terrifying rumors circulated regarding the reasons behind the slayings, Satanism included. As the years went by and the case grew colder and colder, it seemed to sink lower into the public's consciousness until it was almost as good as forgotten. But then, in the late 90s, a local publication known as Weird New Jersey started receiving a series of anonymous letters relating to Jeanette's murder. Weird New Jersey's chief editor and co-founder Mark Moran claimed to have opened his own personal investigation into Jeanette's death and wrote of discovering a number of inconsistencies and suspicious details surrounding the police investigation. He asserted that upon contacting the Springfield Police Department in regards to the old case files, one officer claimed that they had been lost or destroyed over the years. This officer didn't know the circumstances in which the cases had been lost, but promised to get back to Moran when he'd found out. Months went by, and Moran had to once again contact the department in order to receive answers to his queries. It was only then that He was told that the file had been lost due to flooding caused by Hurricane Floyd in 1999. However, just weeks later, Moran said he spoke to another officer who told him that the DePalma murder case files were still in their possession, that they had not been lost or damaged, and that the case remained open. Yet when he asked to take a look at these files, Moran was denied the opportunity by an officer who promptly hung up on him. The evasion did not deter Mark Moran from his investigation. In fact, it did the opposite. Moran describes how the inconsistencies in the information he received only spurred him on to discover the truth, and he eventually ended up working with author Jesse P. Pollock to write the book Death on the Devil's Teeth: The Strange Murder That Shocked Suburban New Jersey. In the course of their research, Pollock and Moran uncovered more and more evidence pointing to a possible cover-up, as well as a list of previously unknown suspects and connections to several other unsolved murders, including those of Joan Kramer and Carol Ann Farino. After interviewing several police officers who were involved with Jeanette's case at the time of her death, Pollock and Moran discovered that several were unconvinced regarding the possible narcotics connection. Heroin use was becoming increasingly popular at the time, with younger users being particularly susceptible to overdosing. Some officers believed that despite there being no needle marks on her arms or drug paraphernalia found at the scene, Jeanette had died of an overdose, and that by the time her body was found, the coroner was simply unable to detect any of the drug in her system. However, after several interviews with Jeanette's friends and family, Pollock and Moran heard that she was not known to have used any recreational or prescription drugs, and that the coroner had only officially chalked her death up to asphyxiation because he couldn't completely rule it out. A 2021 article from the New York Daily News mentions that an organization named Justice for Jeanette DePalma is dedicated to keeping her memory alive. The organizers are continuing to look for clues, even as the case approaches the half-century mark, and have announced that local law enforcement are still interested in finding out what happened to DePalma. But like so many other old cases, the chances of the case being solved becomes less and less likely as the years go by. And if there really is a coven of witches that is responsible for the occult sacrifice of teenage girls, one has to wonder just how long it'll be before they strike again. In the far west of Canada lies a body of water known as the Salish Sea. Straddling the Canadian province of British Columbia and the U.S. state of Washington, the Salish Sea includes an intricate network of connecting channels and adjoining waterways, connecting ports and cities such as Vancouver, Seattle, and Tacoma. At first glance, the Salish Sea is a picture of marine serenity, a haven for oceanic wildlife such as sea lions, humpback whales, and orcas. But looks can be deceiving, and scratching the surface reveals a horrifying series of occurrences that stretch back more than 100 years and have some rather terrifying implications. In 1887, residents of the newly incorporated city of Vancouver made a rather chilling discovery. They discovered a boot washed up on a stretch of shoreline, and since leather was still an expensive and heavily coveted commodity at the time, they attempted to retrieve it in hopes of recycling the material. However, upon picking up the boot, the scavengers recoiled in horror when they found that it still contained the remnants of a human leg. News of the incident became entrenched in local folklore and led to the discovery site being named Leg and Boot Square. History repeated itself on July 30th of 1914, when natives from the village of Kimsquit talked of finding a human leg encased in a high boot near the mouth of the Salmon River. The Vancouver Sun reported that, to the best of their estimations, it had belonged to a man who had drowned on the river the previous summer. But how exactly it became detached from its owner remained a mystery. The grim phenomenon either went unreported or subsided completely for almost 100 years, until finally, in 2007, the discovery of dismembered feet made a sudden and rash reemergence. On August 20th, 2007, an American visitor to the Jedediah Island Marine Provincial Park picked up a size 12 Adidas sneaker, one with a sock still embedded inside of it. It had been lying on a stretch of shoreline, and with curiosity having apparently gotten the better of her, the girl picked it up, thumbed open the sock, then screamed as she was greeted with the sight and stench of rotten flesh. Police were immediately called to the scene, with investigators determining that it was a man's right foot which had become disarticulated due to being submerged in the waters of the Salish Sea. The white and blue mesh running shoe was determined to have been produced in 2003 and distributed mainly in India, while DNA analysis showed the remains belonged to a missing person said to be suffering from a deep depression. Just 6 days later, a second disarticulated foot was discovered by a couple hiking on a nearby Gabriola Island. At first, it was suspected that it may have been the left foot of the depressed missing person, yet when it was discovered that it was in fact another right foot, this theory had to be ruled out. The sneaker itself was a size 12 Reebok that had been produced in 2004, before primarily being sold in North America before being discontinued shortly afterward. The fact that it was also a right foot, and the sneaker had been produced around the same time as the first, led investigators to speculate that there might have been some kind of serial killer at work, one whose modus operandi was to toss the severed right feet of their victims into the sea as a means of taunting the authorities and haunting those that found them. No additional detached feet were discovered until February of 2008, when a right foot and a size 11 Nike were recovered from Valdez Island. The remains were identified as belonging to a 21-year-old man who had been reported missing around 4 years earlier. But local law enforcement was quick to declare that his death was not considered suspicious and that he had died as a result of either misadventure or taking his own life. The man's right foot was later discovered on Westham Island by 2 hikers on June 16th. May 22, 2008 saw the first female foot being found on Kirkland Island. Encased in a blue and white New Balance sneaker, it was thought to have washed down the Fraser River after its owner jumped from the Patullo Bridge in New Westminster in April 2004. Again, it was speculated that the cause of death was them taking their own life, but the woman in question had no history of depression or any other kind of mental health problems, and she had neglected to leave any kind of note prior to her disappearance. The woman's left foot was found floating in the Fraser River in November of the same year. A few months later, the right foot of a man was found covered in seaweed by a camper on a beach near the town of Piesch in Washington state. The large black-topped size 11 athletic shoe was confirmed to contain human bones and flesh by the Clallam County Sheriff's Department, who also determined that the foot had been carried south from Canadian waters. No more severed feet were found washed up on the banks of the Salish Sea for almost a whole year, and some have speculated that this is perhaps the best evidence of a serial killer that currently exists. The massive publicity that the finds generated may have spooked them, causing them to delay any murders or dumping of body parts for a considerable amount of time. It wasn't until October of 2009 that the next detached foot was found, this time in Richmond, British Columbia. The remains were determined to have belonged to a man from Vancouver who was reported missing in early 2008, but the circumstances surrounding his disappearance remained an eerie mystery. The find once again captured the imagination of the public on both sides of the international border, and arguably, this once again caused a potential serial killer to lay low for almost the exact same amount of time, just shy of a year. In August of 2010, a small woman or child's foot was found on the shores of Whidbey Island down in Washington. A detective from the Island County Sheriff's Office released a statement saying the foot would be tested for DNA, but following these tests, there was no match found in any national database that provided a clue to the person's identity. The next foot, discovered on December 5th of 2010, also belonged to a smaller woman or a child and was found on the tidal flats near Tacoma, Washington. The right foot was still inside a boys-style size 6 Ozark Trail hiking boot, and the fact that the feet of 2 separate children were found within just months of each other and in the same area once again fueled speculation of a serial killer. A pattern was clearly forming, one that repeated itself once again where there was a lack of human feet discovered for almost another year. It took until August 30th for another foot to show up, and this time it was discovered near False Creek up in British Columbia. The sneaker in question was a man's white and blue size 9 running shoe and was found floating next to the Plaza of Nations Marina. Unlike many of the other severed feet, this one was still attached to the lower leg bones and had been disarticulated naturally at the knee due to the water. Some argued this was evidence that the whole phenomenon was simply a tragic but natural occurrence, the consequence of the foolish and depressed getting into trouble near the shores of the Salish Sea. But as we all know, it's fairly common for serial killers to switch up their modus operandi in order to throw the cops off their scent. And with heavy speculation blossoming over the origins of the dismembered feet, it's possible that a potential killer might want to make things look as natural and non-suspicious as possible. The next foot was found on November 4th of 2011 on the shores of British Columbia's Sasamat Lake. A man's right foot was found inside a size 12 hiking boot in a pool of fresh water by a group of campers, and in January of 2012, it was identified as belonging to a local fisherman who went missing in 1987. Unbelievably, the Canadian police released a statement saying that the foot separated naturally from the body and do not suspect foul play, even though it wasn't clear exactly how the man had gone missing. Just over a month later, near Seattle's Lake Union, a human leg bone and foot were found wrapped in a black plastic bag under the Ship Canal Bridge, and by January the following year, the Seattle medical examiner had not identified the victim or determined their cause of death. At this point, it's almost like someone was trying to draw attention to the idea that these were no mere accidents. Whoever had tossed the foot into the Salish Sea had taken the time to remove the person's shoe or boot before wrapping it in a plastic bag, almost like they had dithered between not wanting to be caught, but then seeking the infamy of the public knowing there was a serial killer on the loose. After this, between January of 2012 and January of 2019, 8 more human feet, all belonging to different people, have washed up in various places on the shores of the Salish Sea. And while many still chalk the incidents up to a tragic accident and fatal misadventures, I'm very skeptical that such a bizarre and frightening phenomenon can be explained away so easily. If you ask Gail Anderson, a leading entomologist at British Columbia's Simon Fraser University, body parts such as hands, feet, or even a human head can often detach as a result of water-submerged decomposition due to the relatively weak cartilage-based attachment to the greater torso. Such extremities rarely float, but then add a mostly rubber foam sneaker into the mix, or even decomposition-related gases, and you have something that could float for miles before ending up washed ashore somewhere. That still doesn't quite explain how these people's bodies got into the water, but it certainly might rule out the possibility of a serial killer cutting off their feet and tossing them into the sea as a way of frightening law enforcement and the media. However, ask certain members of law enforcement about the incidents, and we get a rather different answer. Both American and Canadian homicide detectives have spoken of how frighteningly unusual it is to find only the feet of the deceased parties, but no other body parts. Some have even mentioned that the odds of finding 2 dismembered feet from the same corpse and still not finding any other body parts washed up has to be around 1,000,000 to 1. Even one of the detectives assigned to one of the cases referred to it as nothing short of an anomaly. Even more suspicious is how close some of the feet have washed up in relation to one another, suggesting that some of them really had been tossed into the water at a very particular location, with set currents taking them in similar directions across the Salish Sea. Over the years, many strong but incomplete arguments have been made which support the idea that the Salish Sea feet are not the result of foul play, but I cannot help but notice a certain pattern which seems to emerge throughout the discoveries. First of all, the vast majority of the appendages discovered are right feet, with the left feet never being discovered. Secondly, from 2007 onward, the pattern of feet found seemed to fluidly transition from male to female to 2 consecutive discoveries of children's feet. It should also be noted that whenever the discoveries got too much attention, the way in which the limbs appeared to become detached looked more and more natural. Yet when interest in the cases waned to its lowest point, it was made clear that there just had to be some kind of human involvement in the discoveries. The reason behind the Salish Sea severed feet may well turn out to be some kind of bizarre but natural phenomenon. But between you and me, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if they turned out to be the handiwork of some sadistic, foot-loving serial killer. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. On the evening of October 5th of 2018, 26-year-old Terrence Woods Jr. was working as a TV production assistant on the first season of the Discovery Channel documentary series Gold Rush, Dave Turin's Lost Mine. He was part of a 12-man team from London-based production company Raw TV who followed host Dave Turin as he explored abandoned mine shafts in the western United States. Given that most of these derelict mines were located in hilly or mountainous regions, some of Gold Rush's filming locations provided incredible views of the surrounding areas. And Terrence took a great deal of pleasure in sharing such incredible vistas with his friends via his Instagram account. One picture depicted a fir forest under a ceiling of steel-gray clouds with a babbling brook flowing through it. Captioned simply, Idaho, the photograph looked like the kind of scene that Bob Ross would paint. Yet as the evening unfolded, the events that transpired would prove to be anything but relaxing. On the contrary, something truly haunting was about to unfold. As the shoot wrapped up in an area known as Oro Grande, Terrence told some of his fellow crew members that he needed to take a leak and would be back in a few minutes. But just moments later, associate producer Simon G. found Terrence's walkie-talkie simply lying in the dirt. Simon wasn't necessarily alarmed by this right away and assumed that Terrence had merely dropped it while looking for a place to pee. But then when he followed in the direction that Terrence had apparently walked off in, he spotted something deeply disturbing. It was Terrence, running down a steep slope at a speed which Simon later described as being faster than he had ever seen anyone run before. Seconds later, Simon watched Terrence disappear into a thicket of greenery. Then he quickly raised the alarm among his coworkers. Terrence's colleagues tore after him at similarly high speeds but were unable to catch sight of him. And just as concerning was the fact that many of the team had suffered cuts and scrapes from the wild and inhospitable forest. If they'd been torn up in such a way while traveling at a fairly measured speeds, I could only imagine the kind of injuries that Terrence had suffered. Yet the one prevailing question wasn't so much where Terrence had run off to. It was what had caused him to become so frightened. Terrence's fellow crew members reported him missing to the Idaho County Sheriff's Office at exactly 6:41 p.m., but due to the darkness that was quickly blanketing the area, the cops didn't begin their search for him until the following morning. His coworkers were incensed by the lack of action, but the county sheriff assured them that it was unlikely that Terrence had gotten far during the night. The rough terrain meant any progress he was likely to make would be slowed considerably, and on top of that, they were going to compensate for lost time by throwing everything they had into the search for him. At first light on October 6th, search teams consisting of foot patrols, ATV riders, and sniffer dog teams were joined by helicopters equipped with heat-sensitive cameras, each spiraling out in concentric rings that cast a wide net over the Oro Grande region. It seemed impossible for Terrence to avoid such an intensive search, yet somehow, not a single trace of him was found. And just 6 days into the operation, the search was called off after the county sheriff declared that there was no way that Terrence could be in the same area he disappeared from. For all intent and purpose, Terrence Woods Jr. had dropped off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. Those that knew him found the story of his disappearance to be completely mystifying. The original Idaho County Sheriff's Office report stated that Terrence was right in the middle of a mental health crisis at the time he vanished, yet his family and friends stated that they had talked to him extensively in the weeks prior, and aside from missing home a little, he seemed perfectly normal. His family then tried to contact various members of the production crew, as well as Oro Grande locals, but found only one that was willing to talk to them. While well-meaning, this local was of very little help and said that it was impossible to determine what kind of mental state Terrence was in during the brief time they'd interacted with him. It got to the point where Terrence's parents, Valerie and Terrence Sr., believed that Raw TV was actually trying to cover up the truth of their son's disappearance. Each asserted that Terrence was a responsible, intelligent young man who wouldn't just run away unless he'd been completely terrified by something. On the other hand, Raw TV denied hiding or obscuring any detail of Terrence's mindset or behavior, with the company's spokesman saying that there is nothing to support such allegations and that Terrence had not been intimidated or mistreated by any of the Oro Grande locals or his co-workers. However, they did state that Terrence's conduct on that set had not been up to his usual standards and that he often seemed distracted during his work. When pressed on the matter, Raw TV CEO Jolie Feather described Woods' disappearance as heartbreaking, adding that the whole company was praying that their friend and coworker would be safely recovered. She was also quick to note that the Idaho County Sheriff's Office had commended Raw TV for their complete cooperation, as well as their ongoing support for the investigation. During his youth, Terrence had spent 5 years in the English capital of London, firstly as a student at the American International University, then working on shows like The Voice UK. He had made many friends during his time in England, and when word of his disappearance reached them, they were nothing short of devastated. One former colleague described him as the most pure-hearted person she'd ever met, that Terrence was calm and gentle, and that she began screaming and crying when she received the bad news. It just didn't make sense, she later said. You know, if somebody's going through something or they're a stressful person or whatever, you're like, okay, cool, the person took off because of mental health or whatever it might be. For Terrence to run off, it's very bad. Disturbingly, this ex-colleague also added that there was something of a toxic work culture at Raw TV, something she herself experienced during her time there, and that on several occasions, she was made to feel quite uncomfortable with what she referred to as somewhat boyish working environment. Raw TV was quick to deny these claims, saying they did the utmost to make their employees feel welcome and comfortable, and their former employees' claims were not reflective of the company's policies. Another former colleague of Terrence's, Rochelle Newman, said that a full investigation should be conducted to discover exactly what caused him to become so frightened. We need a timeline of events from when Terrence arrived in Idaho until they said he disappeared. We need a full investigation into the crew, she said. If it was me who was filming and traveling for work, I would want the same to be done. Rochelle suggested that such an investigation should be entirely civilian-led and urged the Idaho County Sheriff's Office to offer their full support and cooperation. This led to the establishment of an Instagram account entitled @FindTerrenceWoods, which quickly gained upwards of 1,000 followers, all of whom yearned for clarity regarding what happened on the night he went missing. We kept getting conflicting information, said Terrence's mother. One minute the police department are saying the case is closed and the next, they're saying it's still active. This confusion seems to have stemmed from a law enforcement press release which stated that Terrence's case is open but not active, and very little comfort seems to have been taken in the idea that the sheriff's department would follow up on any new information, and that there is no specific amount of time a missing person case remains active. It remains open as long as the person is missing. Given the complete lack of new information pertaining to Terrence's disappearance, a number of theories have emerged regarding what might have happened, or what he might have seen that caused him to become so terrified. The most prevalent seems to involve accusations of racism among the crew, as well as among the local Oro Grande citizenry. Many of Terrence's nearest and dearest have noted that he was the only African-American member of the production crew, and that someone might have taken a distinct disliking to his presence either on the team or in the area in general. It's been suggested that someone took advantage of the fact that Terrence went off to use the bathroom and attempted to ambush or lynch him during the brief window that he was away from the crew. Some believe the fact that his radio was found abandoned is evidence that whoever grabbed him made sure to disarm him of any ability to effectively call for assistance. But if this is the case, why didn't Terrence call for help at any point, even if he was free to do so? It makes sense that whoever grabbed him might cover his mouth, robbing Terrence of his chance to scream for help. But if that was the case, at some point he managed to break free and make a run for it, so why not scream for help then? Again, it's possible there's an explanation for this, albeit a very disturbing one, that the whole production crew wanted Terrence dead, and had told him this either overtly or covertly. If that was the case, it makes sense that Terrence would simply just make a run for it without stopping, looking back, or calling for help. But why wait for an actual attack to occur before getting out of there? In so many words, some have accused the production company, especially associate producer Simon G., of fabricating the story of Terrence running at full pelt in order to cover up that they killed him before dumping his body somewhere it could never be found. Yet the likelihood of the entire crew remaining tight-lipped about such an injustice is extremely slim, and if that was the case, surely the extensive search using cadaver dogs would have at least turned something up. Another arguably more plausible theory is that Terrence had a run-in with some kind of predatory animal, one which stalked him, chased him, and killed him before dragging his dead body somewhere discreet in order to consume it. This might explain why the search teams were unable to locate or recover any of his remains during their intensive and extensive search of the area in which he went missing. Perhaps the cadaver dog teams were simply unlucky in their search, or a stronger odor masked the scent and prevented the dogs from distinguishing the distinct stench of human remains. But anyone who knows anything about a dog's mind-boggling powerful olfactory sense will tell you how extremely unlikely that is. And so, we're faced with the possibility that Terrence either completely extricated himself from the area and managed to do so in almost pitch darkness, or that something otherworldly occurred to ensure that neither he nor his remains would ever be found. There are dozens of less plausible explanations which blame more supernatural hazards for Terrence's disappearance, and although the shroud of mystery makes them more and more worthy of consideration, I don't believe it'll serve his memory well to explore them when much more conventional police work might still yield fruitful results. But still, ruminating on what could scare a man so badly that he'd go tearing off through the woods, injuring himself horribly in the process, is unsettling, to say the least. Back home in Maryland, Terrence's father finds each new day just as difficult as the one which took his son away. "I don't want to watch movies with someone running through the woods because I think of my son," he told one media outlet. "If I close my eyes, I see my son crying and yelling. Some nights I hear my son saying, 'Dad, Dad.' I walk around the house and look at his room." Terrence's parents still display photographs of him on their dresser, and one of his paintings hangs above their bedroom closet. The Dodge Charger Hemi his parents bought for him still sits unused in the family driveway. Every so often, Terrence Sr. runs the engine so that the battery won't run down, hoping that one day, Terrence will return to finally drive it. But as each day passes, as each year rolls into the next, it seems less and less likely that Terrence Woods Jr. will ever make it home. One afternoon, back in January of 1968, a woman named Sandra Jackson was running a bath and heating up a bottle of milk for her 5-month-old daughter, Kimberly. Sandra and her daughter lived in a ground-floor apartment in a small northern English town called Norton, and despite being a low-income single-parent family, they were happy. On the evening in question, while Sandra was waiting for her daughter's bath water to cool, she began heating up some milk in the kitchen while her daughter was in the apartment's backyard. One has to understand that the layout of the apartment meant the kitchen was home to the place's back door, meaning Sandra could keep a close eye on her daughter while she prepared her bottle. Kimberly was sitting in her baby stroller, one that was equipped with a series of wooden rattles that jangled whenever a breeze blew over them. So, to keep her daughter entertained as she went about her business, Sandra wrapped her infant child up in a blanket, then placed her baby stroller outside in order to prevent restlessness and boredom. Sandra later said that, in the course of her motherly duties, she found herself in one of the apartment's front rooms and, suddenly, while looking out of the room's front window, something caught her eye. she saw a teenage boy walking down the street outside, wearing a dark-colored raincoat while pushing a white baby stroller. Sandra observed the boy with a kind of casual curiosity, noting that he seemed to own the exact same model of baby stroller that she did. Yet the thought quickly passed as she finished her business in the front room before returning to the kitchen. But the moment the backyard came into view, Sandra's heart began to race, a wild panic setting in as she realized her own baby stroller was missing. The boy hadn't been pushing a similar-looking stroller at all. He'd been pushing her baby stroller, the one containing her defenseless infant daughter. Sandra rushed to inform the local police force that her daughter had been kidnapped, and given that the suspected kidnapper was on foot, they rushed into action in the hopes that they would be apprehended quickly. As law enforcement scoured the area, Sandra remained at home, her terror rendering her almost incapacitated as a pair of elderly neighbors tried but failed to comfort her. Meanwhile, a police officer on the hunt for little Kimberly's kidnapper discovered her stroller abandoned in a parking lot just a short distance away, near a place known to the locals as Billingham Bottoms. Billingham Bottoms was a popular fishing spot and consisted of a medium-sized fishing lake along with several smaller ponds. Given that the stroller was abandoned, the officer kept an eye out for a teenage boy carrying a baby in his arms. But as he walked, he spotted something which took his breath away. Lying face down and fully clothed in one of the area's smaller tadpole ponds was baby Kimberly. She was motionless, having drowned after being tossed into the water, presumably by her teenage kidnapper. Investigators determined that Sandra's backyard was connected to an adjacent alleyway, one which would be publicly accessible as it lacked any kind of fence or a gate. Yet despite being accessible, the backyard wasn't visible from the main street, meaning Kimberly's kidnapper had to have walked down the back alley on a whim, only to find a target of opportunity as he found himself in Sandra's backyard. This suspect had been spotted by Sandra's neighbors as the boy pushed the stroller down the street and was later described as being between 12 and 14 years old, standing between 4'6" and 4'11". He had an average build and was said to have a friendly-looking face with clear skin and dark, bushy hair. He also wore a dark green hooded anorak with a white shirt underneath. One eyewitness mentioned spotting the boy near the Billingham Bottoms pond where the deceased Kimberly was later found, and that he was still pushing the stroller but that it was empty. This led police to believe that the boy had kidnapped Kimberly before immediately pushing her stroller in the direction of the pond, having always intended to end her life by drowning from the moment he laid eyes on her. But with regards to motive, the police were mystified, and the only thing any of them could agree on is that it was most likely an impulsive, spur-of-the-moment killing with the victim chosen completely at random. A composite image of the boy was produced by collating eyewitness descriptions of him, and door-to-door inquiries were carried out in the hopes of finding him. The police even accompanied a still grieving Sandra on a tour of 19 local schools in the hope she might be able to identify him as one of the pupils there. But even after such an extensive examination of local children, Sandra failed to identify any of them as her daughter's kidnapper. Some officers began to consider the terrifying possibility that Sandra had actually hired the boy to dispose of her daughter, as it seemed impossible that such an intensive investigation could fail to yield any kind of result. And although it might seem unusual for a mother to leave her child unattended in a backyard, even in frigid January weather, many have attested to the fact that the late 60s were a completely different time, a time when neighbors trusted each other and the wider consciousness of the public was considerably more innocent. As for Sandra, the level of grief and guilt she displayed, and the fact that she pushed for the case to be reopened on multiple occasions in the years that followed, convinced many of her innocence. "Knowing that I saw him take my baby away is killing me," she once told the media, "and I have suffered for it all my life with depression." For some, the idea that such a young person could commit such a heinous act was almost too horrible to consider. Unless the boy suffered from some kind of learning difficulty, someone in their early teens is more than old enough to know right from wrong. But what if the boy's intentions hadn't quite been as malicious as many believed? What if he'd simply decided to take her for a walk around Billingham Bottoms, and during the course of showing her some of the tadpole ponds, he'd accidentally dropped her into the water? Someone with diminished intelligence might easily panic if such an event occurred, or they might not even realize the severity of their actions until it was too late. However, this idea has been rolled out by the fact that Kimberly's kidnapper had removed the wooden rattles from her stroller and was intelligent enough to realize that not only would it make her stroller more recognizable, but they might also attract unwanted attention due to the distinct noise they made. It's extremely unlikely that anyone with any serious learning difficulties or benevolent intentions would think to do such a thing, and this alone is evidence enough that Kimberly's murderer had evil in his heart that day. Yet as the investigation failed to produce any serious evidence, it stalled, with the case eventually turning cold. 36 years later, in 2004, a 57-year-old Sandra Jackson once again called for the investigation into her daughter's kidnap to be reopened. "His fingerprints should have been all over the pram," she said in a newspaper article which revisited the details of the case. "I want to know if any were kept and if the case can be looked at again. I was young at the time and so naive and didn't understand investigations, but things have come on so far since then. The person who did this may have been arrested since for something and their records be on file, or the guilt they're feeling could make them hand themselves in." As a way of raising awareness for the 3-decade-old crime, the newspaper sensationalized the crime by reframing the killer as an angry young victim of abuse who wanted to hurt someone even more vulnerable than him as a way of getting back at the world. Sadly, the re-examining of the case was fruitless, and to this day, Kimberly's murder remains unsolved. Even more tragic is the fact that in the same year that Sandra appealed for the case to be reopened, her 26-year-old son died of a drug overdose. Having struggled with addiction all his life, Aaron Jackson had been clean for 18 months when he suddenly relapsed, and his death added another layer of tragedy to Sandra's long life of suffering. With every year that goes by, Kimberly Jackson's kidnap and murder becomes less and less likely to be solved as her case becomes increasingly forgotten. But even more unlikely is the idea that her killer would ever forget committing such an act of evil. If there's even a shred of humanity in them, they'll be haunted by the memories of abducting and drowning a 5-month-old child. But then again, there's always the frightening possibility that they look back on their youth, remember the monstrous act they committed with a sickening kind of fondness. Maybe they look back on the day they got back at a world that they didn't understand, or had so horribly mistreated them, and they simply smile. Aaron Taylor grew up in Bend, Oregon, as the 5th child of a Mormon bishop. Then, when Aaron was just 10 years old, his family relocated to the Phoenix Valley in Arizona. He was an intelligent, well-behaved child, but one that fell in with a bad crowd during his high school years. As a result, he began experimenting with drugs and alcohol, which resulted in a series of run-ins with local law enforcement. Once Aaron reached high school and received a little more freedom, he began to act out. He wanted his friends and other students to accept him, and he began pushing the boundaries, diving into alcohol and drugs and getting into problems with the law. During his mid-20s, Aaron decided to make a positive change in his life, and he attended Grand Canyon University in order to earn a graduate equivalency degree, or a GED. Yet he just couldn't seem to keep himself out of trouble, and ended up going to prison for 7 years after being convicted of burglary. After an early release, he refused any aid from his parents and ended up living on the streets. They made numerous attempts to find him, but none were successful, and tragically they would never again see their troubled young son alive. On Christmas night of 2007, Aaron was sitting outside a Subway sandwich store on the corner of Cactus Road and Paradise Village Parkway. Despite his tough life, Aaron was known as a kind and gentle soul, but he was not without enemies. For quite a while at that point, 3 local youths have made it their mission to make Aaron's life as difficult as possible. Employees of the nearby subway said that they personally witnessed the youths pouring liquids on him, taping him to a bench, getting him extremely drunk, or even throwing him into a fountain. Then, on Christmas night, while in a particularly cruel mood, one of the youths was spotted flicking lit matches onto Aaron's beard. At exactly 6:56 p.m., a call came into the local police station. The caller told the cops that there was a mannequin that was on fire, but when the cops arrived, they discovered it was no mere plastic model that was ablaze. It was Aaron. The security guard from a local Circle K was trying in vain to smother the flames with his jacket, and although one officer attempted to resuscitate him, Aaron was pronounced dead upon his arrival at a nearby hospital. Aaron's friend, a maintenance man from nearby Paradise Valley Mall, was tasked with pressure washing the bench the next morning, only to learn that the area he was pressure washing was the scene of his friend's death. It was Christmas Day. Somebody should have brought him some turkey or something, the maintenance man said in an interview. Instead, somebody burned him alive. To this day, Aaron's murder has never been solved, and despite the campaign of harassment he was subjected to, no one seems to have any idea who his 3 tormentors were. As a result, 3 people are still free to walk the streets, having done something truly obscene to a vulnerable, troubled young man, and having completely gotten away with it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, always check your rice for weevils.